Hi, we move into a new unit in 2 Samuel as we explore chapters 8 to 10 as part of the sequence, as you can see on the right side of the screen, of David's consolidation of the legitimacy of his royal reign. And as we'll see in these chapters, 8 and 10 involve battles and summaries of David's battles. And to many scholars and many readers, our eyes can roll over the names of these obscure people from the past that don't have much of the role in the rest of the story. In fact, we'll see specifically how Ammonites and Arameans are really concentrated in these chapters here. But what I'd like to highlight here is not the details of that, because none of us really care about the ancient battles in their details, but of how, as Bruce Halpern has shown in such detail, being an archaeologist and a historian and examining literally the data on the ground as well as the textual data, that there's a lot more going on beneath the surface. And what I'd like to suggest is what we see in chapters 8 and 10 of 2 Samuel is an excellent display of how royal propaganda works, where readers, whether nowadays or in the past, skim over it. It sounds like David has just killed everybody and defeated everybody. But especially once we get past some of the errors in the translation in the New RSV on the left side, which often over-translates in favor of the traditional interpretation, we can see with the help of Halpern and others that it's not quite as clear exactly what's going on as it seems on the surface. Not only that, it's not clear if we try to separate it out of the sequence of events and their timing. And I'm not going to try to sort that through, try to say what really happened and how much is a story being told here for some other reason, because that would involve diving into Halpern in detail, and he provides more than 100 closely argued pages about these couple of chapters. And so your eyes would really roll over that, and I imagine we don't really care. But what's important here, I think, for our purposes, is not so much did these things really happen, but how the narrative is being shaped in order to give us an impression that David has been a powerful king, and like other kings before him, whether Saul, as we'll see a summary of his defeats of others, or apparent defeats of others, or other kings throughout the Mediterranean ancient world, they do what kings do, protect them from their enemies. Because that goes back to 1 Samuel 8, of course, that the people of Israel demanded a king in order to be like the other nations to defeat the Philistines. And we'll see the Philistines in the first verse here, but only in passing, and then we'll see others along the way. And the absence of Philistines really, especially for Halpern, raises some implicit questions of what's really going on. So we can see, as I'll show you here, there's a certain shape to these chapters that fit together in parallel to what we saw in 1 Samuel 24 to 26, which is to say back there were two stories in parallel, and scholars oriented around sources want to argue they're from different sources, but hopefully, as I argued well enough there, that's not only not necessary, but defeats the literary structure that we see here, that surrounding being the surrounding frame here of these confrontations with Saul is David taking control of the house of Nabal, a threatened enemy there. And what we see parallel here is in the middle of these reports of victory, David takes control of the house of Saul, a threatened enemy. And so there's a certain parallel between these two sections. And what we'll see is they not only are parallel here, but there's also a parallel we'll see in chapter 10 and what follows with Saul's defeat in chapter 15. So a number of ways in which the text in these following chapters is comparing David at this point with Saul at the same point in his reign. But as you can see in the second half of what I have on the right side of the screen, as Isaac Kalimi has shown in some detail in a 2016 article, there are many ways, and this is one of them, to show that 10 to 12 fit nicely together. And if you're not familiar already, chapter 11 is, of course, the famous story of David and Uriah and Bathsheba, and that continues to chapter 12. And what he's suggesting is that the wars framing this, and there's a little piece, as we'll see here in 12:26 to 31, a little postscript of David's military victories over the Ammonites and Arameans that follows after here, that frames the whole David and Bathsheba and Uriah business around the question of wars, and highlighting that in chapter 11 it highlights that in the spring of the year when kings go out to war, David is sitting on the roof of his palace spying his neighbor's wife. And so we'll see that that's another way to look at that, is not only to 8 and 10 frame chapter 9 here around the house of Saul, which of course is part of the consolidation of his royal reign on these categories here, but also it connects us with chapter 10 to 12 to highlight the downfall of David that's beginning, and we'll go through the rest of the book almost all the way through Absalom's rebellion that takes us all the way up to chapter 19 and then up to 20. So we'll see how the story makes a turn to tragedy after this summary. And perhaps really the summary that we'll see here is meant to be dull in a certain way, in great contrast with the psychodrama, the sexual psychodrama we're going to see in the next couple of chapters, with much deception and trickery and emotion and death. And as opposed to these ironically lifeless stories of killing people. And one of the things we need to do to look at that is highlight language. So just one piece of that here. So in the New RSV, we hear things like defeated, and killed here, and yet every time it's using the same Hebrew word for struck. And so if we take away killed and defeated and we just hear struck, we realize that struck is ambiguous. David had struck the whole army of Hadadezer, but did he defeat them? It's not clear. And so the actual Hebrew text is much more ambiguous about what the outcome of these attacks is than the New RSV and perhaps other translations make it look like. So, and one other aspect of this that we'll highlight, in a traditional atlas like this makes it look like there are facts here, and we see David's roots of conquest and the Edomites' threat and the Aramaean forces, etc. here. And yet, again, as Halpern shows, much of this makes no sense really, because the locations are not very specific. For example, look, starting in verse 1, sometime after David attacked the Philistines. Where? Where did he attack the Philistines? And the only location mentioned here, Megath Amma, is a completely unknown place, not a traditional place of the Philistines. And so we really don't know. And even on this map, this reference here is not to our immediate passage, but to 2 Samuel 5, to an earlier situation. And so we have to take all these with a certain grain of salt, as well as some of the language, to be able to read through it in some detail. So let's put this up here, and we'll just begin to enter into the immediate first verses of our scene so we can see what's going on in just the language. And again, I really just want to highlight how the text seems to convey one thing when it might well be conveying another. So as we enter into this, I'd just like to survey, just very briefly in my notes below, some of the different ways that scholars approach this, so we can see how Halpern's really flies in the face of that in a way that's really interesting. So as I note just here in summary, he offers several chapters, and that's what I just summarized. We'll look at the details as we go. As Rochelle Gilmore notes this way, these chapters 8 and 10 mark a change in the type of military activity in which David engages. In the wars of chapter 8 and 10, David is in the offensive position rather than defending his own territory. He makes vassals and takes land. So in doing that, she's focusing on the kind of activity rather than the extent of it. Here from Robert Barron, my favorite commentator to make fun of and really lambast, because the irony here in terms of faith positions is that someone like Baruch Halpern, as a Jew, writes very critically of David, and here's Robert Barron, who is a Catholic bishop, who makes David sound like he's Jesus, even though he's a murderous imperialist, and somehow Barron seems to praise that. As I've said repeatedly, he's clearly the most intellectually dishonest interpreter I've ever read in this book, and I really want to highlight that because he's very popular, and yet he's just a terrible biblical scholar. He's not a biblical scholar at all, really, and his work is very misleading, both in the text and in terms of the theological contrast between David and Jesus, as we can see in my Luke's Gospel series, where the question of whether Jesus is son of David is one that Luke really has to take up. So that's the extreme of just praising David as if his military conquests are exactly what the God of Jesus would be in favor of. Here's another view. The placement of 2 Samuel 8 immediately after the promise, which we just looked at in chapter 7, spells out the grandeur of David's conquest as quote-unquote proof that the oracle containing the promise had begun to take effect as soon as it had been uttered, empowering David's conquest in the region as an expression of Yahweh's favor. So he's certainly seeing that as part of propaganda too, that by putting it here, the narrator or the writers are highlighting that the promise seems to be fulfilled immediately, that David is successful, and that the reasons they wanted a king all the way back to 1 Samuel 8 are being fulfilled here. So just a few approaches. As Halpern notes out immediately here, this immediate phrase here, Vahi Ahari Ken, sometime afterward as it's translated, he notes, is part of the editorial construction of the whole book. This permits the reader to think of it as a third battle without the author falsifying information. And I won't go through this in the same detail I've been going through other texts, but I just want to highlight some of the examples of that as we see. We see here a number of places seemingly the personal and singular aspect of how the story shows David. David is doing this. David attacked the Philistines as if there's no army. He also defeated them. He also struck down. He took. David put garrisons, as if it's just him doing it by himself, because from a royal propaganda perspective, only the king matters. All his troops are just background to this. So, attack the Philistines. There's no "the" in Hebrew. As Badham notes, not a full-fledged attack on the Philistine homeland. Simply attacked Philistines, not the Philistines. So, some Philistines, it's unclear. As Samora notes below, after the time of David, there are no references to battles with the Philistines till the time of Hezekiah. And as Halpern also notes, I don't have the note here exactly, if David was about defeating Philistines, then why didn't they stop him from moving his headquarters to Jerusalem? As we saw in 1 Samuel, David worked for the Philistines, and it was only because the lords of the Philistines distrusted him that King Achish sent him back to Israel. But whether David is still sympathetic to the Philistines or has friends there isn't clear. But the text certainly wants to make it look like, at the beginning here, that he is against the Philistines. So this very vague description that he hit some Philistines and subdued them, which was what we heard in 1 Samuel 7:13 at the very beginning, before Saul was king, of course, that some Philistines were subdued, but that's certainly not defeating them, because in the very next chapter in 1 Samuel, they're right back. So it suggests just something that for casual readers sounds like, oh, he defeated the Philistines. But as I'm trying to show here, it's not as clear as that. Then he took the strangely named place, which literally means bridal slave girl, method for bridal, as it's used a number of times as a bridle for a horse, and amma for slave girl. But as scholars have noted in the Brown Driver Briggs Lectionary suggests, it can also mean mother city, although it's not the mother city of the Philistines at all. Halpern notes that it's a problematic term here, which may refer back to the icon taken at 521, but we don't have to look at that now. And my note below is really summarizing what I just said that Halpern said. So we'll look at a few more verses so we can see what's going on here. Let's look at the verse, and then we'll look at Halpern's notes below. He also struck here, didn't defeat, the Moabites, which is interesting because according to the book of Ruth, which is the book that precedes 1 Samuel, David is descended from the Moabites. According to Genesis, the Moabites come from Lot's liaison with his daughters in the cave, which is a pretty ugly version of it. But here it says he struck Moabites and then does this very strange ritual, which is not attested anywhere else, making them lie on the ground, measured them off with a cord. He measured 2 lengths of cord for those who were to be put to death and 1 length for those who were to be spared. And the Moabites became servants to David and brought tribute. And as I've been reading carefully, following Halpern's lead, I note how many scholars assume that he put people to death, but note that it doesn't say that. It just says he measured the cord, and the Moabites became servants. So maybe simply measuring the cord out was enough to scare them into being servants without him actually killing anybody. But notice how quickly we can jump to the conclusion that he killed them. But it doesn't say that, does it? The word for measured here, medir, twice in the verse and not elsewhere in 1 Samuel. It's only a couple other times in the Deuteronomistic history, but not related to our scene here. And as my note here says from Samora, there's no attestation for this kind of procedure anywhere else. So it seems like the author is just making it up, or if it's for somewhere else, we don't know. And the term for brought tribute here, minha, means gift, and it'll also be used in verse 6 here. I note that it's parallel to what Jacob brings to Esau in the context in Genesis 33, where he's seeing Esau with his 400 men as similar to what we see here as an international force that's threatening him. So we could translate that tribute as well. And of course, as you might, shouldn't say of course, but if you're not familiar with my Genesis series or that text, Jacob similarly refers to his brother as my Lord and himself as servant, much as the people do in this story here. And there are many parallels between the David story and the Jacob story, as I've been trying to show both directions, and we'll see more of that as we go. So now there's something against the Philistines, and now something against the Moabites, and now we reach a little longer story, and I'll go into just a couple more places so we can see just the story of this before we go on to the next unit. So he also struck, finally, the translators have it as struck, King Hadadezer here, who we'll see again in chapter 10. And so you can see the parallel. It's not a key word, so I didn't put him as a parallel here, but that's one of the links between chapter 8 and 10. And then this description here of son of Rahab of Zoah. As my note here, the Masoretic text sequence is ambiguous. It could be the other way around. That is, Hadadezer could be either the biological son of Rehab or simply the reigning monarch of the house of Rehab, as Halpern notes. Going down further, and I'm pretty sure this is these are all from Halpern. No, this is from the scholar named another Jewish scholar. Scholars have long recognized that Ben Rahab, meaning son of, does not refer to Hadadezer's father, but rather to the land of origin, and that was a king of Beth Rehob and Zobah. It seems to me that the figure of Hadadezer, Ben Rehob, king of Zobah, was modeled upon the historical figure of Hazael. And I won't get into all those details, but notice that he's doing the similar kind of thing that I'm suggesting Halpern is doing, is seeing that behind the stylized story here are other historical events that are not being portrayed, quote-unquote, accurately. In the case that we know accurately what's happening, it's obviously impossible to know what really happened from all that time back, except through correlation with archaeology, and for much of this we don't have that. But it's noting how vague it all is. It sounds so much more clear in the text than when we look behind it. So as he went to restore his monument, literally to return his hand, and as Graham Old notes, the common word hand, yad, is also the regular term for the erect male member, and by extension for other erections like standing stones, symbolizing dominant authority. And that idea that there'd be a phallic symbol to symbolize royal authority will come up, no pun intended there, in 1 Kings, when David's grandson, Rehoboam, wants to use a symbol of his own male member power to get the Israelites to conform to him, and fails, as we'll see. So this is setting up something we'll see there. At the river Euphrates, it doesn't say Euphrates, as it almost never does, simply says the river. It's only here in Judges through 1 Kings. Otherwise, it's in Deuteronomistic history, framing the entire story at the beginning of Joshua and at the end of Kings, highlighting, as I've been suggesting, and others as well, the exilic provenance of the final version. And certainly, the final version can't be pre-exilic since it narrates the story all the way up to exile. So scholars can at least agree on that the final version of 2 Kings can't have happened before the events narrated in them took place. Some argue it's much later, but we don't have to get there right now. So he's suggesting that this king here is somebody powerful in the entire Mesopotamian area. When we look at the map here, Mesopotamia is not even on the map. This is way off, off on the other side here, and so there's no sense that they're going that far. And we'll just go another verse or two to finish this immediate scene here. So David took from him these large numbers of horsemen and soldiers and hamstrung all the chariot horses. And scholars argue about that in a way, whether that's to use them for domestic uses or not, but we don't have to get into those details either. Now that he's done that, he's at least managed to take from them these horsemen. And notice it doesn't say what he did with them. He took 1,700 horsemen. Does he kill them? Does he make them work for him? Again, notice how vague this all is. So when the Arameans of Damascus, which is up here as we see, came to help, literally, as we can see here, using the term that we saw back in Genesis 2 for the construction of the woman, Ezer Kenegdo, which is the partner alongside, so not the helper as in the traditional thing, but with Kenegdo it means alongside in Genesis. Here it doesn't necessarily mean that, so it can mean help here, but certainly not helpmate as the sexist version that we see in older translations in Genesis 2 have. So the Arameans came to help him, and this is not killed either. This is struck again, as we can see here. Now, when you hear that 22,000, it certainly implies killed. If he struck them and didn't kill them, what's the point exactly? But maybe that's the point, that it's not clear, that some he killed and some he didn't. And of course, how do we know about those numbers? Was somebody out there counting? So these numbers certainly seem like they're fanciful as well. And we'll continue this next verse where there's one of the summaries that we'll see again in verse 14. So David put garrisons here, Netzavim here, and we'll see that in 8:14 in the parallel summary. The first foreign military outpost of Israel's monarchy. And yet, as Halpern notes, verse 14 shows the repetition to clarify the extensive territories being claimed, whereas this only suggests it. We only see the term for garrisons in these places earlier. And curiously, we see it one time for Lot's wife, another connection in there, surprisingly, back to Genesis. So among the Arameans of Damascus, and the Arameans, became servants to David and brought tribute. And Yahweh gave victory to David wherever he went. And yet, even victory is misleading here. I left it that as it is. Actually, I didn't. I made it more literal here so we can see. Yahweh gave all to David. There's not a word for victory. So that all, what does it mean? Right now, all it's seen is that he's gotten horses and he's gotten some captives, perhaps, but it doesn't say anything like victory. So we'll pick it up there, and it continues into another context here of some more of this, and maybe we'll get through the whole chapter, maybe we won't, but hopefully we'll see, as the pattern continues, that it's setting up in the center the situation about one particular person that it gets to in detail. So we'll continue here next time. See you then. Bye-bye.